Dearest listeners, they say that music is the food of love. But what happens when one's beloved cannot distinguish a pianoforte from a harpsichord, or indeed, a symphony from the sound of carriages rattling over cobblestones? Today, this author brings you the most harmonious tale of discord and devotion, of fingers fumbling upon ivory keys and hearts finding their perfect rhythm. But let us not rush, for the best scandals, like the finest wine, must be savored properly. Our tale begins in the spring of 1818, in the fashionable quarters of Mayfair, where Miss Charlotte Westbrook resided with her widowed mother in genteel, though somewhat strained circumstances. At 19, Charlotte possessed three remarkable qualities: beauty that could stop conversations mid-sentence, a wit sharp enough to slice through the thickest pretension, and fingers that could coax magic from any pianoforte. One must confess, gentle listeners, that Charlotte's talent was both her blessing and her curse. While young ladies of the ton practiced their scales as a necessary, if tedious, step towards snaring a husband, Charlotte played because the music lived in her very soul. It was her language, her confidant, her sanctuary from a world that often felt discordant and shallow. This author has it on good authority that more than one eligible bachelor had declared himself smitten after hearing her perform a particularly moving piece by Beethoven, only to discover in subsequent conversation that Charlotte cared more for the composer's turbulent emotional landscape than for bonnets, and more for the structure of a Mozart sonata than for the prospects of matrimony. Such conversations rarely led to a second call. Her mother, dear Mrs. Westbrook, whose nerves were as frayed as the drawing-room curtains, despaired quite vocally. A young lady could not, after all, marry a pianoforte, no matter how beautifully it sang beneath her fingers. Her duty was to secure a match that would ensure both her own future and her mother's comfort. But Charlotte would merely offer a gentle, enigmatic smile at such pronouncements and launch into another sonata, losing herself in the world where only melody mattered, a world where she was in complete control. Would you believe, dearest listeners, that on this particular April morning, Charlotte sat at her beloved instrument, her fingers dancing through a complex Bach fugue, completely unaware that her life was about to change in the most unexpected manner? This author finds it rather amusing how fate enjoys surprising those who believe they have their futures perfectly orchestrated. The summons arrived with the morning post, an elegant card bearing the gray family crest, delivered by a footman in livery so pristine it made the Westbrooks' modest door look rather shabby in comparison. The Dowager Countess of Ashford requested Miss Westbrook's presence at her Berkeley Square mansion that very afternoon. The matter, the note indicated with delicious vagueness, concerned a situation of some delicacy requiring discretion and musical expertise. Charlotte's mother nearly required her vinaigrette. The Greys were one of the oldest and most respected families in England. The Dowager Countess, a formidable woman who could freeze presumption with a single raised eyebrow, did not issue invitations lightly. Speculation ran wild. Perhaps the Countess wished Charlotte to perform at a grand soirée. A music teacher for a young Grey relative? The possibilities seemed endless, each more advantageous than the last. But Charlotte, ever practical despite her artistic soul, suspected something far more complex. The mention of discretion particularly intrigued her. When the nobility speak of delicate situations, gentle listeners, scandal invariably lurks in the shadows. That afternoon, Charlotte found herself in the imposing gray drawing room, a vast chamber of pale blue silk and gilded furniture, facing the Dowager Countess across a tea service that likely cost more than the Westbrook annual income. The older woman studied Charlotte with eyes that missed nothing, not the careful mending on her gloves, nor the quiet confidence in her bearing, nor the way her fingers unconsciously moved on her lap as if playing an invisible pianoforte. After the requisite pleasantries about the unpredictable spring weather, the Countess set down her teacup with a decisive click. She required, she announced, her voice as crisp as starched linen, nothing less than a miracle worker. Charlotte, maintaining her composure admirably, pointed out that she was merely a music teacher, not a saint. The ghost of a smile flickered across the Countess's austere features at this display of spirit. The truth, when it emerged, was more shocking than any Gothic novel. Lord Sebastian Grey, heir to the Ashford title, celebrated sportsman, respected member of Parliament, a man whose grace on a horse was legendary and whose charm was said to be irresistible, was, and this author quotes directly from the Countess's pained admission, completely, utterly, catastrophically tone-deaf. One must pause here to appreciate the magnitude of this revelation. Tone deafness in a Grey? It was akin to discovering that a fish feared water or that a Frenchman disliked wine. The Greys had patronized musicians for generations. Their musical soirees were legendary. And yet their heir. The situation, the Countess explained with visible distress, had reached a crisis point. Lord Sebastian, in a moment of spectacular pride and one suspects a considerable amount of fine claret, had accepted a wager from the odious Lord Pemberton. He must perform a piece on the pianoforte at the annual Grey musical soirée, mere 6 weeks hence. The stakes of this foolish bet? Nothing less than his right to court Lady Marianne Pemberton, that gentleman's exquisite sister. This author finds it necessary to explain the Byzantine complexity of this situation. The Pembertons and Greys had been rivals for 3 generations. Lord Pemberton, knowing full well of Sebastian's musical deficiency through some treacherous spy, had laid his trap with Machiavellian cunning. If Sebastian failed to perform adequately, he must withdraw his suit and watch Lady Marianne wed Mr. Algernon Harrington, a man whose only recommendation was his willingness to be Pemberton's puppet. Charlotte listened to this tale with growing amazement. The sum the Countess offered for her services was staggering. It would secure her mother's comfort for years. But teaching a tone-deaf gentleman to perform in 6 weeks? She might as well attempt to teach a fish the cotillion. It was not merely difficult, it was, by all laws of music and nature, impossible. Yet something in the Countess's eyes, a grandmother's desperate love beneath the aristocratic hauteur, touched Charlotte's heart. Against her better judgment, against every rational thought in her very rational mind, she heard herself agreeing to attempt the impossible. The relief that flooded the Countess's face was almost worth the certain disaster that awaited. Almost. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, rather fitting for what Charlotte privately considered her descent into madness. She arrived at Berkeley Square precisely at 10, her music case clutched like armor against the unknown. The Grey Mansion's music room was a symphony in itself, all pale blue silk and gilt, with a broadwood grand pianoforte that made Charlotte's fingers itch to play. French doors opened onto a garden where early roses climbed trellises, their scent mixing with the beeswax and lemon oil that preserved the precious instrument. It was a room that promised beautiful music, a promise that was about to be brutally broken. This author has it on good authority that Charlotte heard Lord Sebastian before she saw him. The sound of boots taking the stairs 2 at a time echoed through the house, accompanied by a rich baritone humming something that bore no resemblance to any melody known to mankind. The very walls seemed to wince at the assault. Then the door burst open with such force that a Ming vase trembled on its pedestal. Gentle listeners, steel yourselves for this moment, for even this author, who has witnessed countless first meetings, found this one particularly significant. Lord Sebastian Grey stood in the doorway like a figure from a Byron poem. If Byron's heroes arrived windblown, slightly damp from rain, and grinning with the unrepentant charm of a boy caught stealing tarts. At 25, he possessed that particular brand of masculine beauty that made sensible young ladies suddenly understand why their mamas issued so many warnings. Dark hair fell across his forehead in careful disarray. His eyes, gray as his name, sparkled with mischief and something else that Charlotte would later identify as desperate hope masked by bravado. His shoulders filled his coat admirably, speaking of hours in Gentleman Jackson's boxing salon, and his smile, Oh, that smile could have charmed birds from trees, if any birds could have tolerated his singing. Charlotte, who prided herself on her composure, found herself oddly breathless. She rose from her seat by the pianoforte, dropping into a curtsy that she hoped masked her sudden confusion. This was her student, she reminded herself firmly. The fact that he looked like temptation personified was entirely irrelevant to the task at hand. Lord Sebastian executed a bow that would have been perfectly proper, if not for the fact that he nearly knocked over the priceless vase in earnest this time. His apology for his tardiness came with an explanation. He had been attempting to practice and lost track of time. His valet, he admitted with rueful charm, described his efforts as an assault upon the innocent air. One must confess, dearest listeners, that most gentlemen would rather face Napoleon's army than admit to such a failing. But Lord Sebastian's self-deprecation held no self-pity, only a cheerful acceptance that charmed more effectively than any pretense could have. Charlotte suggested they begin with an assessment of his current abilities. The look of pure dread that crossed his handsome features would have been comical if she hadn't felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. Here was a man who likely excelled at everything: riding, shooting, fencing, politics, reduced to fear by a simple pianoforte. He approached the instrument as one might approach a wild animal, warning her that his grandmother had not exaggerated. He once attempted to sing the national anthem, he confided, and was accused of treason by a patriotic footman. What followed, gentle listeners, when he placed his hands upon the keys, this author can only describe as oral catastrophe. Imagine, if you will, a cat walking across the keys while simultaneously being strangled by a violin string. The notes that emerged bore no relation to each other or to any known musical principle. It transcended mere badness and achieved a kind of terrible magnificence. Charlotte stood frozen, her musical soul crying out in anguish. When Lord Sebastian finally stopped, the silence rang louder than any symphony. For the first time since his entrance, his jovial mask slipped, revealing genuine distress beneath. "You see," he said, his voice quiet, "it is hopeless." This author finds it fascinating how a single moment can change everything. As Charlotte looked at this powerful lord, humbled and exposed by his inability to create beauty, she saw not a hopeless case, but a challenge. More than that, though she would not admit it for weeks to come, she saw a man worth helping. "Stand up, my lord," she instructed, her voice regaining its professional calm. "Walk to the window and back." His confusion was evident, but he obeyed, moving with the natural athletic grace of a born sportsman. Charlotte observed the rhythm in his stride, the unconscious musicality of his movements, and felt the first stirring of hope. "You possess rhythm, my lord," she announced. "That is half the battle. The other half, we shall approach as a problem of engineering rather than art." To demonstrate a point, she sat at the keys. She explained that music was not about perfection, but about feeling, about translating emotion into sound. She played a simple melody, nothing more than a nursery rhyme, but she invested it with such feeling, such melancholic beauty, that it seemed to transform into something greater, a lament for lost childhoods. Lord Sebastian's face underwent a remarkable transformation as the notes filled the air. His eyes softened, his stance relaxed, and for a moment, the weight of his impossible task seemed to lift from his shoulders. He might not hear music properly, Charlotte realized, but he felt it in his soul. Would you believe, dearest listeners, that in that moment, Lord Sebastian looked at Miss Charlotte Westbrook as if seeing sunshine after a long storm? This author certainly noticed the way his eyes lingered on her face, the way he leaned slightly forward as if drawn by invisible strings. He was not looking at a music teacher. He was looking at the music itself. By the third week, a curious transformation had overtaken the gray music room. What had begun as formal instruction had evolved into something far more complex, a delicate dance of denial that this author finds absolutely delicious to relate. The air, once thick with professional tension, was now charged with an electricity of a different, far more dangerous sort. Lord Sebastian, you see, had developed a most intriguing habit. He would arrive earlier each day, armed with increasingly creative excuses. One morning, he claimed he needed to warm up his fingers with the special exercises Charlotte had taught him. Another day, he insisted the morning light in the music room helped him see the keys more clearly, as if lighting had ever helped anyone hear better. He even brought her a rare book of sheet music he'd stumbled upon at Hatchard's. "It is a rather obscure piece by a German composer," he said, avoiding her eyes. "I thought it might aid in our study of structure." It was, of course, a composition by Bach she had mentioned in passing weeks before, one she had long given up hope of ever finding. The gesture was so thoughtful, so personal under its thin, professional guise, that Charlotte was left speechless, merely clutching the book to her chest. Charlotte, for her part, began bringing extra music sheets she claimed might help, lingering after lessons to explain theoretical concepts that Lord Sebastian had already grasped. She told herself it was professional dedication. This author suspects otherwise, particularly given how often she adjusted the ribbons in her hair before entering the gray mansion. The entire household had begun to notice. The footmen exchanged knowing glances when Lord Sebastian actually hummed, still dreadfully off-key, while reviewing parliamentary papers. The housemaids whispered about how their young master had been seen purchasing every book on musical theory, creating quite the sensation when he asked the bewildered clerk if they had anything on making tone-deaf gentlemen musical. But oh, the resistance they both maintained. It was truly a performance worthy of Drury Lane. When their fingers accidentally touched on the keys, both would jerk back as if burned, followed by elaborate apologies. When Charlotte leaned close to adjust his posture, her lavender scent filling the small space between them, Lord Sebastian would hold his breath, a fact that did not escape her notice, though she pretended otherwise. This author's favorite incident occurred during the 4th week. Charlotte was demonstrating a particularly delicate passage, her slender fingers dancing across the keys. Lord Sebastian, supposedly watching her technique, was in fact studying the way the morning light caught the golden threads in her brown hair. So absorbed was he that when Charlotte asked if he understood the fingering, he replied with a sigh, "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." The silence that followed was positively symphonic in its awkwardness. Charlotte, her cheeks pink as spring roses, clarified that she meant the musical fingering. Lord Sebastian, recovering with less grace than he'd shown falling off his horse, agreed heartily that yes, the fingering was indeed what he'd meant. Neither mentioned that the passage she'd played had been particularly mundane. Society buzzed with speculation. Most shocking of all, he'd been overheard telling Lord Ashbury that he couldn't join their usual Tuesday night cards because he had a prior commitment to Chopin. The fact that he pronounced it Chopin only added to the general amazement. This author must also report on a certain afternoon tea hosted by Lady Danbury, which both Miss Westbrook and Lady Marianne Pemberton attended. Charlotte watched from across the room as Sebastian engaged in polite conversation with his intended. There was nothing improper, yet seeing them together, the handsome lord and the porcelain beauty, a perfect match in the eyes of the ton, sent a sharp, unexpected pang through Charlotte's heart. It was a discordance, a painful reminder of the wager and the reality of their situations. But the true test of their mutual denial came during an unexpected encounter at Hatchard's. Charlotte, searching for a rare composition, literally collided with Lord Sebastian. Books flew everywhere, and in the scramble to collect them, their hands touched and lingered over a volume of Mozart sonatas. For a moment, the mask slipped. He looked at her with such undisguised longing that this author, observing from behind a convenient shelf of poetry, nearly swooned herself. Her eyes reflected the same desperate want, the same sweet confusion. Then, as if remembering, both stepped back. They inquired after each other's health with stilted politeness and parted ways with such obvious reluctance that even the shop clerk shook his head. The Dowager Countess, nobody's fool, observed these developments with considerable satisfaction. But here, dearest listeners, was the most delicious irony. Lord Sebastian was actually improving. Not dramatically, but his mechanical playing had developed a certain competence. Charlotte noticed this with mixed feelings. Success meant the end of their lessons. She found herself unconsciously slowing their progress, introducing unnecessary complications. One morning, as rain lashed against the windows, she moved from her usual chair to sit next to him on the bench, claiming she needed to better observe his hand position. The bench, designed for one, forced them into a proximity that propriety would never allow. They sat thus for nearly an hour, Charlotte guiding his hands with gentle touches, both pretending not to notice the electricity that sparked between them. The piece he played was simple, but under their joined hands, it became a confession without speech. When the clock chimed, they separated with guilty starts. Neither mentioned that he had played the last piece perfectly. The most telling incident occurred just days before the soirée. Charlotte arrived to find Lord Sebastian in the music room with Lady Marianne Pemberton herself. Charlotte froze in the doorway, her music case suddenly weighing like lead. This was the goal, she told herself, her heart splintering. Lord Sebastian's reaction was far more revealing. He leapt from the bench as if scalded, his face cycling through guilt, panic, and relief at her arrival. What followed was perhaps the most uncomfortable half-hour in recent memory. Lady Marianne attempted to stay for the lesson. Charlotte maintained rigid professionalism. Lord Sebastian played so badly that even his usual terrible standard seemed virtuosic by comparison. Finally, the Dowager Countess arrived and smoothly extracted Lady Marianne. Once alone, they stood in silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Lord Sebastian confessed that when Lady Marianne had praised his playing, all he could think was that Charlotte would have been honest about his failures. When she'd placed her hand on his arm, he'd felt nothing, not the electricity that sparked every time Charlotte's fingers brushed his. Charlotte, with heroic effort, reminded him that Lady Marianne was his prize. Lord Sebastian's response, that perhaps some prizes weren't worth winning, hung in the air between them like an unplayed chord, full of possibility and promise. The afternoon of the 5th week brought with it an unseasonable storm that battered London. Charlotte arrived at the Grey Mansion soaked despite her umbrella. Lord Sebastian, who had been pacing the room like a caged panther, took one look at her and immediately rang for tea and towels. His concern was so genuine, so tender, that Charlotte found herself dangerously close to tears. The music room, usually filled with sunlight, was now dim and intimate, lit only by the fireplace. Rain lashed against the windows, creating a curtain between them and the world. It was the sort of atmosphere that makes one forget propriety, duty, and everything but the person standing before you. As Charlotte dried her hair by the fire, Lord Sebastian watched with an expression that would have scandalized society. When she shivered, he moved closer, ostensibly to adjust the fire screen, but really to share his warmth. When she smiled her thanks, something shifted in the air, something that had been building for weeks, finally crystallizing into undeniable truth. They moved to the pianoforte in silence. Charlotte began to play, not the simple pieces they had been learning, but something of her own composition, something she had never shared. The melody that flowed from her fingers was haunting, beautiful, and achingly sad. It spoke of chances not taken, of words unspoken, of two souls reaching for each other across an impossible divide. As she played, tears began to fall. Lord Sebastian stood transfixed. Though he could not appreciate the musical complexity, he understood the emotion perfectly. This was Charlotte's heart, poured out in notes, and it was breaking. When the last note died away, the silence was deafening. What came next, dearest listeners? was Lord Sebastian's hand, gentle on her shoulder. When she looked up at him, his face was transformed with an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. Without a word, he sat beside her on the bench, closer than propriety allowed, closer than friendship permitted, exactly as close as her heart demanded. Then he did something extraordinary. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play her composition. It was imperfect, hesitant, with wrong notes. But it was hers, memorized from that single hearing, played with such concentration and devotion that every mistake became a declaration. When he finished, Charlotte was crying in earnest. Not from sorrow, but from a joy so profound it could only express itself through tears. He had heard what she couldn't say and responded in the only language they had been allowed to share. Without conscious thought, both turned toward each other. The space between them disappeared. Her hand rose to touch his face, finding it wet with his own tears. Lord Sebastian's fingers tangled in her still damp hair. This author held her breath as they hovered on the brink of a kiss that would change everything, the silence of the room broken only by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain. But then, oh cruel fate, the door burst open. The Dowager Countess entered, followed by Lord Pemberton, come to finalize the details of the wager. Charlotte and Sebastian sprang apart, but not quickly enough. The guilt on their faces was more damning than any embrace. Pemberton's eyes narrowed with malicious satisfaction. Charlotte, with admirable presence of mind, rose and curtsied. She announced that the lesson was concluded and that Lord Sebastian had made remarkable progress. She left with her head high, but this author, following at a discreet distance, saw her collapse against the garden wall once out of sight, pressing her fingers to her lips as if trying to preserve the memory of a kiss that hadn't quite happened. Inside, Lord Pemberton was all false bonhomie, his comments about the charms of music teachers just shy of actionable insult. Lord Sebastian confirmed the terms of their wager with cold precision. The Countess, showing the strategic mind that had made her a social force for 5 decades, waited until Pemberton departed before informing her grandson that he was a fool if he let that remarkable girl walk away for the sake of the vapid Marianne. But Lord Sebastian, torn between duty and desire, insisted the wager must be honored. Win or lose, he realized with dawning horror, he would lose Charlotte. The next morning brought disaster in the form of a note. Charlotte received word via a footman that Lord Sebastian would no longer require her services. The soirée was in 3 days, and he felt sufficiently prepared. A bank draft was enclosed, the full amount promised, plus a generous bonus for her excellent instruction. Charlotte stared at the formal, impersonal words, searching for some hidden message, some sign that yesterday had meant as much to him as it had to her. But the note, clearly written in the precise, emotionless script of a secretary, contained nothing but polite dismissal. It was a door slammed shut, a melody cut short. This author later learned the truth of this horrible misunderstanding. Lord Sebastian, after a sleepless night pacing his study, had convinced himself that his presence in Charlotte's life could only bring her scandal and ruin, especially after Pemberton's visit. He believed, oh foolish, noble man, that a clean surgical break would be kinder than a gradual, painful separation. He was setting her free from a connection that society would never approve. He had not written the note himself because he knew that if he put his own pen to paper, his resolve would crumble, and the letter would become a confession instead of a dismissal. He thought he was being honorable, making a great sacrifice for her benefit. Charlotte, of course, knew none of this. She saw only rejection, cold and final. Proof that whatever had almost happened between them in the firelit music room was merely a moment's madness on his part, a weakness he now regretted. The passion she had felt, the connection she had treasured, all a one-sided delusion. Her mother found her an hour later, sitting at the pianoforte, the bank draft torn into tiny pieces scattered like snow around her feet. She wasn't crying. She was beyond tears. She simply sat, staring at the keys as if they had betrayed her. Mrs. Westbrook, showing unexpected wisdom born from her own past heartaches, gathered her daughter into her arms and let her talk. The whole story poured out. The lessons, the growing attachment, the almost kiss, the horrible, sterile note. Her mother listened without judgment, occasionally making soothing sounds and stroking her hair. When Charlotte finished, her voice raw with unshed tears, her mother asked only one question. Did she love him? The answer, when it came, was barely a whisper. Yes, completely, desperately, hopelessly. Then there is nothing hopeless about it, Mrs. Westbrook declared, her voice imbued with a streak of steel Charlotte had never suspected. You will attend that soirée. We have connections enough to secure invitations. You will hold your head high, you will wear your best gown, and you will show that man and all of London exactly what he has so foolishly discarded. Charlotte protested that she couldn't bear to watch him perform for Lady Marianne, couldn't endure seeing them together, but her mother was firm. Running away will only confirm the gossips, she insisted. You are a Westbrook. We do not run. Besides, she added, a flicker of her daughter's wit in her eyes, after all that work, do you not wish to see if your impossible student actually learned anything? Meanwhile, at the Grey Mansion, Lord Sebastian was descending into his own private hell. He attempted to practice, but found the pianoforte held only memories of Charlotte. The faint scent of her lavender soap, the rustle of her sheet music, the very air seemed to echo with her laughter. The Countess, watching her grandson move through the house like a ghost, reached the end of her considerable patience. She cornered him in the library and demanded the truth. When Sebastian confessed his noble intentions, she actually threw a cushion at his head. Shocking behavior for a lady of her generation. Did he think Charlotte a fool? She demanded, incapable of making her own choices? Did he imagine she would thank him for deciding her future without consultation? Had all those hours of music lessons taught him nothing about harmony, about how two different notes could create something beautiful together? But Lord Sebastian, stubborn in his misery, maintained his course. The die was cast. In 2 days, he would perform, win his wager, and begin courting Lady Marianne. It was, he insisted, with the conviction of a man determinedly lying to himself for the best. The night of the Grey musical soirée arrived with all the pomp society expected. Carriages lined Berkeley Square, depositing the cream of the ton in their finest evening wear. The Grey Mansion blazed with light, every window glowing like a jewel against the dark sky. This author, naturally, was among the first to arrive, securing an excellent position from which to observe the evening's drama. The music room had been transformed into a performance space, with rows of gilt chairs facing the pianoforte. That noble instrument, polished to mirror brightness, stood like an executioner's block, waiting for its victim. Lord Pemberton arrived early, Lady Marianne on his arm. She wore white, naturally, the picture of innocent beauty awaiting her musical prince. He, on the other hand, radiated a smug confidence, whispering to his cronies and casting triumphant glances toward the piano. The Dowager Countess received her guests with her usual regal bearing, but those who knew her well detected an unusual tension. She had done what she could, but her grandson's stubbornness had proved insurmountable. All she could do now was hope for a miracle. When Charlotte entered with her mother, a visible ripple went through the assembled company. Those who knew her as a simple music teacher gasped at the transformation. She wore a gown of deep emerald green silk, a color that spoke of life and resilience. Her hair was styled elegantly, and though she was pale, she moved through the crowd with a grace that owed nothing to her modest origins and everything to her natural dignity. Heartbreak, it seemed, had given her a new determination to show Lord Sebastian exactly what he had lost. Lord Sebastian arrived precisely at 8, looking magnificent in evening dress, but with the haunted eyes of a man on his way to his own execution. His eyes swept the room, widening when they found Charlotte. For a moment, he stood frozen in the doorway, drinking in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst. Charlotte, for her part, lifted her chin and met his gaze steadily. If her hands trembled, she hid them in the folds of her skirt. If her heart raced, she masked it with serene composure. She had come to see this through, whatever the cost. The torture of waiting began. Miss Ashford played Bach. Lady Jane Merriweather assaulted Haydn. Through it all, Charlotte sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on some point above the pianoforte. Lord Sebastian never looked away from her. His entire being seemed focused on the woman in green silk who was determinedly not looking at him. Finally, the moment arrived. The Countess announced her grandson's performance with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The room fell silent, anticipation thick as London fog. Lord Sebastian rose and walked to the pianoforte. He sat, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. For a long moment, he simply sat, head bowed. Then he looked up, directly at Charlotte. Gentle listeners, what happened next exceeded all expectations. He did not play the Mozart sonata he had prepared. Instead, his fingers found the opening notes of Charlotte's composition, the piece she had played for him that rainy afternoon. A collective gasp went through the room. The melody, even imperfectly played, was hauntingly beautiful. But more than that, it was clearly a declaration. Every note screamed of love, of longing, of a desperate desire to communicate what words could not say. Charlotte's carefully maintained composure cracked. Tears began to fall, silent but unstoppable. He played with fierce concentration, his technical limitations obvious but irrelevant. This wasn't about winning a wager. This was about telling the only person who mattered that she had been heard, understood, and answered in the only language they had truly shared. When he reached the section where the melody became almost unbearably tender, this author swears she saw him mouth the words, "Forgive me," before returning to the keys. And then, disaster. Or perhaps, destiny. His concentration, focused entirely on Charlotte, wavered. His finger slipped, hitting a wrong note so jarring it made several ladies wince. He tried to recover, but the piece stumbled to a halt, unfinished. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Lord Pemberton's smile was triumphant. But Charlotte stood. Every eye in the room turned to her as she walked toward the pianoforte. Her mother reached for her, but Charlotte gently freed herself. She moved with purpose, with the kind of determination that could change destinies. She reached Lord Sebastian, who sat frozen in misery. Without a word, she placed her hand on his shoulder. Then she did something that set society talking for months. She sat beside him on the bench. She placed her hands over his, her fingers guiding his back to the keys. Together, they finished the piece. The final chord resonated with such emotional truth that hardened matrons reached for their handkerchiefs. The applause, when it erupted, was thunderous, but they heard none of it, looking at each other as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Lord Pemberton, red-faced, stood to declare the performance invalid. But the Countess, magnificent in her triumph, cut him off. The terms, she reminded him, specified only that Lord Sebastian must perform a complete piece. Nothing had been said about performing it alone. More importantly, Lady Marianne herself stood and crossed to the pianoforte. In a clear voice, she congratulated Lord Sebastian and released him from any obligation to court her. She had realized, she said with a meaningful look at Charlotte, that his heart was already engaged elsewhere. Lord Pemberton, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, stormed from the room. But none of this mattered to the two people at the pianoforte. Lord Sebastian turned to Charlotte, his hands shaking as he took hers. He had been a fool. Could she forgive him? Charlotte's response needed no words. She leaned forward and kissed him. The room erupted in shocked gasps and delighted applause. When they finally parted, Lord Sebastian announced that Miss Westbrook had taught him that perfection was less important than passion, and that the only melody worth playing was the one that resonated in both their hearts. Then, in full view of London's elite, he dropped to one knee. 6 months later, on a perfect autumn morning, Lord and Lady Grey stood before the pianoforte in their music room. The space, once the site of such desperate struggle, now rang with laughter. Charlotte, resplendent in a morning dress of soft blue, watched with fond amusement as her husband attempted a simple scale. His playing had improved marginally, but music would never be his forte. This didn't matter. What mattered was the way he looked at her when she played, the way he requested her composition every evening before bed. Their musical soirees became the most sought-after invitations of the season. Not for the quality of Lord Sebastian's playing, but for the obvious devotion between the couple and the way Lady Charlotte, how that title suited her, could make even the most tone-deaf guest feel welcome. She founded a school for young ladies of modest means, ensuring that talent would never be wasted for lack of funds. Lord Sebastian, in a display of husbandly devotion, attended every recital, applauding enthusiastically even when the performances were objectively terrible. This author visited them recently and can report that their firstborn, a boy with his father's mischievous gray eyes, was attempting to bang on the low notes of the pianoforte while his mother played the high notes, creating their own special kind of duet. The Dowager Countess declared it the finest performance she had ever witnessed. Love, she pronounced, made its own music, and theirs was a symphony. This author must agree. In all my years of observing the ton, I have rarely seen a couple so perfectly matched in imperfection. He still could not sing in tune, and she still preferred Beethoven to bonnets. But every evening, without fail, he would attempt her composition, their song. And every evening, she would sit beside him, guiding his hands, falling in love all over again with each wrong note. And now, dearest listeners, I must turn to you. Did this tale of a love found in wrong notes and right feelings move you? Your likes are the modern equivalent of a well-placed compliment, and I shall treasure them. Pray, share your thoughts in the comments. I find myself endlessly fascinated by your perspectives. And to ensure you are alerted the very moment my next dispatch is made public, do subscribe and perhaps even engage that curious little bell icon. A rather insistent contrivance, I am told, but a most effective one for ensuring one never misses the latest news. And so, gentle listeners, another tale reaches its blessed conclusion. This author withdraws until our next encounter. Until then, remember, the greatest scandals often lead to the greatest happiness, and the worst musicians sometimes make the best husbands. Your devoted chronicler, Lady Ravenswood.